The September morning air carried a different weight across London. Margaret Thompson stood at her kitchen window, watching the early commuters hurry past her small flat near Westminster. Today marked exactly 1 year since Queen Elizabeth II had passed away, and the entire world seemed to pause in remembrance. Margaret, now 73 years old, had been a royal correspondent for nearly 4 decades. She had covered every major royal event since the early 1980s, from weddings to scandals, from jubilees to funerals. But nothing had prepared her for the profound silence that followed the Queen's death on September 8, 2022. The woman who had been the steady heartbeat of the nation for 70 years was gone, and the world was still learning how to breathe without her. As Margaret sipped her morning tea, she remembered the phone call that changed everything. It was 6:30 in the evening when her editor called. The Queen's health had taken a serious turn. By the time Margaret reached Balmoral Castle in Scotland, crowds were already gathering. The official announcement came at 6:30 p.m. Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II had died peacefully at Balmoral that afternoon. The silence that followed was unlike anything Margaret had ever experienced. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. People stood in the Scottish countryside, many crying, others simply staring at the castle where their queen had spent her final moments. Margaret had covered wars, disasters, and tragedies, but this felt different. This was the end of an era that most people had never known life without. Now, 1 year later, Margaret found herself assigned to cover the memorial events taking place across the globe. It wasn't just Britain mourning. From Canada to Australia, from Jamaica to New Zealand, the Commonwealth nations were holding their own remembrance ceremonies. Even countries outside the Commonwealth were marking the day. The Queen had touched lives in ways that surprised everyone. Margaret's first stop was St. James's Palace, where a special exhibition had been set up showcasing letters and tributes from ordinary people around the world. The exhibition coordinator, Sarah Chen, was a young woman in her 30s who had been working at the palace for 5 years. "We received over 2 million letters and cards," Sarah explained as she guided Margaret through the exhibition. From children who drew pictures of the Queen's corgis, to war veterans who met her during official visits, to families who had received royal messages during difficult times. Each letter tells a story. Margaret stopped at one display case containing a letter from an 8-year-old girl in Kenya. The child had written in careful handwriting, "Dear Queen, thank you for visiting my country before I was born. My grandmother says you planted a tree that still grows in our village. I hope you are happy in heaven with your husband and your dogs." Another letter caught Margaret's attention. It was from a man in his 60s from Birmingham who had met the Queen during a factory visit in 1995. He wrote about how the Queen had stopped to talk with him about his work, asking genuine questions and listening to his answers. "She made me feel important for those 5 minutes," he had written. "I never forgot her kindness." Sarah pointed to a wall covered with photographs. These are pictures sent by families showing how they celebrated royal events. Jubilee parties, wedding celebrations, coronation commemorations. The Queen was part of their family traditions for generations. As Margaret examined the photographs, she noticed something remarkable. The images spanned decades and showed families of all backgrounds, in countries across the world, celebrating British royal events as if they were their own family occasions. Street parties in Australia, tea parties in Canada, church services in New Zealand, and community gatherings in African and Caribbean nations that were once part of the British Empire. "What strikes me most," Sarah continued, "is how personal these memories are. People don't just remember the Queen as a distant figure. They remember specific moments when she touched their lives, even briefly." Margaret interviewed several visitors to the exhibition. An elderly couple from Wales had traveled to London specifically for this anniversary. The woman, Mrs. Davies, told Margaret about the day she received a telegram from the Queen for her 100th birthday. "I couldn't believe it when the postman brought it," Mrs. Davies said, her eyes brightening at the memory. "A message from the Queen herself. My great-grandchildren were so excited. We framed it and it hangs in our sitting room. Even now, visitors ask to see it." Her husband added, "She was our Queen, but she felt like our neighbor too. Always there, always steady. When everything else in the world was changing, she was the same. That meant something to us old folks." A young father visiting with his 2 children had a different perspective. I'm 35, he told Margaret. I never knew a world without Queen Elizabeth. When she died, I realized my children would grow up in a completely different Britain. I brought them here so they could understand what she meant to people like my grandparents. His 7-year-old daughter tugged at his sleeve. Daddy, why are people crying at the pictures? She asked innocently. The father knelt down to her level. Because they love the Queen very much, and they miss her. Sometimes when we love someone a lot, we cry when we remember them, even if the memories are happy ones. Margaret found this exchange particularly moving. It highlighted something she had been thinking about for months. The Queen's death had not just marked the end of her life, but the end of a shared experience that had united people for 7 decades. Children born after September 2022 would never know the strange comfort of having the same monarch their entire lives, the way previous generations had. Later that day, Margaret visited Westminster Abbey, where a special memorial service was being held. The abbey was filled with people from all walks of life. There were members of Parliament and ordinary citizens, young and old, from many different countries. The Archbishop of Canterbury spoke about the Queen's legacy of service and duty. She taught us that leadership is not about power over others, but service to others, he said during his sermon. In a world that often celebrates the loud and the flashy, she showed us the strength of quiet dignity and consistent devotion. After the service, Margaret interviewed Dr. Robert Harrison, a historian who had written several books about the monarchy. He helped her understand the unique nature of the mourning they were witnessing. What we're seeing, Dr. Harrison explained, is not just grief for a person, but grief for a concept of stability that many people fear we've lost. The Queen represented continuity in a world of constant change. She was the same reassuring presence through the Cold War, through technological revolutions, through social upheavals, through pandemics. People are mourning the loss of that anchor. Margaret asked him about the global nature of the mourning. Why were people in countries that had no formal connection to the British monarchy still marking this anniversary? The Queen became a global symbol, Dr. Harrison replied. Even in countries that had difficult histories with the British Empire, she personally was seen as someone who acknowledged past wrongs and worked for reconciliation. Her Christmas broadcasts reached people everywhere. She became a grandmother figure not just to Britain, but to the world. As evening approached, Margaret made her way to Buckingham Palace, where thousands of people had gathered throughout the day. The gates were covered with flowers, photographs, and handwritten messages. People stood quietly, some alone, some in small groups, simply being present in the place most associated with their queen. Margaret struck up a conversation with Maria Santos, a nurse who had immigrated to Britain from the Philippines 15 years earlier. Maria had brought her 3 young children to place flowers at the palace gates. When I came to this country, I knew nothing about the royal family, Maria explained. But, during the pandemic, when I was working in the hospital, the Queen's messages gave me strength. She spoke about hope and endurance. She made me feel like I belonged here, like I was part of something bigger than myself. Maria's eldest daughter, 10-year-old Sophia, had drawn a picture of the Queen surrounded by her famous corgis. I never met her, Sophia said, but my mum says she was kind to everyone. I wanted to draw something that would make her happy. As darkness fell, a spontaneous singing began among the crowd. Someone started God Save the King, the national anthem that now honored King Charles III, but then, the singing shifted to God Save the Queen, the version everyone had known for so long. Voices joined together in the cool September evening, creating a moment of shared memory and collective mourning. Margaret found herself thinking about her own relationship with the Queen. As a journalist, she had observed the monarch from a professional distance for decades. She had watched her age from a middle-aged woman into an elderly one, had seen her adapt to changing times while maintaining her essential character. The Queen had been a constant in Margaret's professional life, a story that continued through every major event of the past 40 years. But, it was more than professional. Like everyone else in Britain, and, indeed like millions around the world, Margaret had felt a personal connection to this woman she had never actually met. The Queen had been there for every Christmas, every national celebration, every moment of crisis. She had been a shared reference point that connected strangers across continents. As Margaret finally made her way home that evening, she reflected on what she had witnessed during this day of remembrance. The grief was real and deep, but it was also mixed with gratitude. People weren't just mourning what they had lost, they were celebrating what they had been privileged to experience. The Queen's death had marked the end of the longest reign in British history, but it had also revealed something beautiful about human nature. People's capacity for loyalty, for respect, for love of someone who embodied the best qualities of service and dedication. The outpouring of emotion wasn't just about royalty or tradition, it was about recognizing greatness in the form of humble, consistent service. In her small flat that night, Margaret began writing her article about the day's events. She wanted to capture not just the facts of the memorial events, but the feeling in the air, the sense that something profound had ended but also that something important would continue. The Queen was gone, but the example she had set, the standard she had maintained, the grace she had shown, these things lived on in the millions of people around the world who had been touched by her life. Tomorrow, Margaret would continue her coverage of the anniversary events. There were more stories to tell, more people to interview, more aspects of the Queen's global legacy to explore. But tonight, she simply sat with her tea and remembered a remarkable woman who had dedicated her entire adult life to serving others, and who had somehow managed to make the whole world feel like one enormous, complicated, but ultimately loving family. The morning of September 9 found Margaret Thompson on a train heading north to Edinburgh, Scotland. The Scottish capital was hosting a special week-long festival celebrating the Queen's connection to Scotland, where she had spent her final days at Balmoral Castle. Margaret had received reports that the memorial events in Scotland had a particularly intimate and emotional character, quite different from the formal ceremonies in London. As the train pulled into Waverley Station, Margaret could immediately sense the atmosphere was different here. Scottish flags flew alongside Union Jacks, and the Royal Standard of Scotland was prominently displayed throughout the city. This was, after all, where the Queen had felt most at home in her later years, spending every summer at Balmoral and finding peace in the Highland landscape. Margaret's first stop was the Palace of Holyrood House, the Queen's official Scottish residence. A special exhibition had been arranged in the palace gardens, featuring photographs and stories from local people who had encountered the Queen during her many visits to Scotland over the decades. The exhibition was organized by Fiona MacLeod, a curator who had worked with the Royal Collection for 15 years. Fiona explained to Margaret that the Scottish memorial events had a uniquely personal character because the Queen's relationship with Scotland was so deeply personal. She wasn't just Queen of Scotland by title, Fiona explained as they walked through the garden exhibition. She genuinely loved this country. She understood Scottish culture, she respected Scottish traditions, and she made real friendships here that lasted decades. The exhibition featured stories that illustrated this personal connection. There was a photograph from 1952, the year Elizabeth became Queen, showing her at a Highland Games event. She was 26 years old, laughing as she watched cobber tossing, clearly delighted by the traditional Scottish sport. Another photograph from 60 years later showed her at the same Highland Games, now in her 80s, but with the same genuine smile as she watched the same events. Margaret was particularly moved by a display about the Queen's relationship with her Scottish household staff. Unlike the formal protocols of Buckingham Palace, Balmoral had always operated more like a family home. The exhibition included testimonials from staff members who had worked there for decades, some for their entire careers. Agnes McBride, who had been a housekeeper at Balmoral for 35 years, had provided a written account of her experiences. Her Majesty wasn't just our Queen at Balmoral, she had written. She was part of our community. She knew all our names, asked about our families, remembered our birthdays. When my husband was ill, she personally ensured he received the best medical care. She attended our children's christenings and our parents' funerals. She was, in the truest sense, our neighbor. Another staff member, James Robertson, who had served as a ghillie, hunting and fishing guide at Balmoral for 40 years, described how the Queen would often join him for walks in the hills, discussing the wildlife and the landscape. She knew every hill and glen around Balmoral, he had written. She could identify every bird and flower. This wasn't performative knowledge for royal visits, this was genuine love for the land and its creatures. Margaret interviewed several visitors to the exhibition who shared their own memories of encountering the Queen in Scotland. An elderly woman named Mrs. Campbell told the story of meeting the Queen during a walkabout in Stirling in 1977. "I was just a young mother with my baby son," Mrs. Campbell recalled. "The Queen stopped to talk to us, and she asked about the baby. When I mentioned he had been born premature and we'd been worried about his health, she spoke so gently about how strong babies can be, how they often surprise us with their resilience. My son is 45 now, and a doctor himself. I always think the Queen's encouragement that day was a good omen for his life. A middle-aged man named David Stewart shared a more recent memory from 2017. He had been part of a community project restoring a historic village in the Highlands when the Queen made an unexpected visit. She wasn't there for any official ceremony, he explained. She had simply heard about our project and wanted to see it. She spent over an hour with us, asking detailed questions about our restoration techniques, offering suggestions from her own experience with historic properties. She rolled up her sleeves and helped us plant some trees. At the end, she said she was proud of what we were accomplishing for future generations. From the palace, Margaret travelled to Edinburgh Castle, where a special military ceremony was being held. The Queen had been Colonel-in-Chief of numerous Scottish regiments, and the military connection was particularly strong in Scotland. The ceremony featured representatives from the Royal Regiment of Scotland, the Scotsguards, and other units with which the Queen had maintained personal relationships. Colonel William Macpherson, who had served with the Royal Regiment of Scotland for 30 years, spoke to Margaret about the Queen's relationship with Scottish military personnel. She wasn't just a ceremonial figurehead, he explained. She knew our regimental history, our traditions, our concerns. She would spend time with injured soldiers, visit military families, attend regimental celebrations. When we lost men in Afghanistan and Iraq, she personally wrote to the families. These weren't form letters, they were personal messages that showed she understood our loss. The ceremony included the reading of letters from military families across Scotland. One letter, from the widow of a soldier killed in Afghanistan, particularly moved the assembled crowd. Your Majesty always remembered our sacrifice, the letter read. When my husband died, you sent a personal message that I treasure to this day. You called him a hero, but you were our hero too. You carried our grief with dignity and honor. Thank you for never forgetting us. After the military ceremony, Margaret made her way to the Royal Mile, where local communities had organized a series of smaller, more intimate memorial events. These were not official ceremonies, but grassroots expressions of affection and remembrance organized by ordinary Scottish people. At one small church near the castle, a group of elderly women had organized a memorial tea party. They had set up tables with traditional Scottish refreshments and created a display of photographs showing royal visits to their neighborhood over the years. Margaret was invited to join them for tea and conversation. We've been doing this every year for decades, explained Mary MacDonald, one of the organizers. We started having royal wedding parties, then Jubilee celebrations, and now this memorial. The Queen was part of our community tradition. The women shared stories spanning multiple generations. Mrs. Edinburgh told Margaret about her mother's encounter with the Queen Mother and young Princess Elizabeth during World War II. My mother was working in a munitions factory in Glasgow, she explained. The royal ladies came to visit, to boost morale. My mother said Princess Elizabeth, who was just a teenager then, spoke to each worker individually, asking about their work and their families. My mother never forgot how genuine and interested she seemed. Another woman, Mrs. Ross, shared a more recent memory from the Queen's Platinum Jubilee year. I was in hospital for my hip replacement when the Jubilee celebrations were happening. I was so disappointed to miss our street party. But the nurses told me the Queen had sent a message to hospitals across the country, thanking patients and staff who were missing the celebrations because they were serving others or receiving care. That message was read to us in the ward. Even from my hospital bed, I felt included in her celebration. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret observed something remarkable about these Scottish memorial events. There was a warmth and intimacy that felt different from the more formal ceremonies in London. People spoke about the Queen as if she were a beloved family member who had lived among them, not a distant monarch they had only seen on television. This impression was reinforced when Margaret visited a small Highland village about an hour outside Edinburgh. The village of Glen Morrison had a population of only 300 people, but they had organized their own memorial ceremony that drew visitors from across the region. The local minister, Reverend Ian Campbell, explained to Margaret why this small village felt such a strong connection to the Queen. She visited us 3 times over the years, he said. Not for any grand ceremony, but because she was genuinely interested in Highland life. She helped us save our village school when it was threatened with closure, and she supported our efforts to preserve traditional Highland crafts. The village memorial took the form of a ceilidh, a traditional Scottish social gathering with music, dancing, and storytelling. As Margaret watched, she saw 3 generations of villagers sharing memories, singing traditional songs, and celebrating the Queen's life in a way that felt authentically Scottish. An elderly man named Hamish McBride played the bagpipes, performing a lament he had composed in the Queen's honor. She understood our music, he told Margaret. When she visited, she didn't just politely listen to our performances. She asked questions about the history of the tunes, about their meaning. She once requested that I play a particular pipe tune that most people have never heard of. She knew our culture. A young woman named Flora Campbell, probably in her 20s, offered a different perspective. I know some people my age think the monarchy is outdated, she told Margaret. But the Queen was different. She respected our traditions when other people thought they were old-fashioned. She helped preserve our language, our music, our way of life. Because of her support, I grew up speaking Gaelic and knowing our traditional dances. She gave us permission to be proud of being Scottish within the United Kingdom. As evening approached, Margaret joined the villagers for a torchlight procession to a small memorial cairn they had built in the Queen's honor. The cairn was constructed in the traditional Highland way, with each villager adding a stone and making a personal commitment to carry forward some aspect of the Queen's example of service. Children had prepared their own contributions. 8-year-old Jamie MacLeod placed a smooth river stone on the cairn and said, "I promise to be kind to animals like the Queen was to her horses and dogs." 10-year-old Moira Campbell added her stone and promised, "I will always remember to help elderly people like the Queen did." These simple, heartfelt commitments moved Margaret profoundly. The village schoolteacher, Mrs. Stewart, had organized the children's participation in the ceremony. She explained to Margaret that teaching children about the Queen's example had been part of the school curriculum for years. "We don't teach monarchy as a political system," she clarified. "We teach service, duty, kindness, and perseverance through the Queen's example. These are values that will serve our children well regardless of their political views as adults." As the torchlight procession wound its way back to the village center, Margaret found herself walking alongside Dr. Sarah Mackenzie, a young doctor who had recently moved to the village to serve the rural community. Dr. Mackenzie shared her own connection to the Queen's memory. "I decided to work in rural medicine partly because of the Queen's example," she explained. "She showed us that true privilege means having the opportunity to serve others. I could have worked in a prestigious city hospital, but I chose to serve this community because I believed, like the Queen, that everyone deserves quality care regardless of where they live." The evening concluded with a simple ceremony where the villagers lit a beacon that would burn throughout the night. Similar beacons were being lit across Scotland and throughout the Commonwealth nations. As Margaret watched the flame illuminate the Highland landscape, she reflected on the day's experiences. What she had witnessed in Scotland was different from the formal ceremonies in London, but equally powerful. Here, the Queen's memory lived not in grand institutions but in the daily lives of ordinary people. Her example of service had inspired 3 generations of Scots to contribute to their communities, to preserve their traditions, and to care for one another. As Margaret prepared to return to Edinburgh that night, she realized she was documenting something unprecedented in modern history. Never before had the death of a monarch generated such genuine, widespread, and lasting emotional response from people of all backgrounds and nations. The Queen's legacy was not written in stone monuments or official documents, but in the changed lives of millions of people who had been inspired by her example. Tomorrow, Margaret would continue her journey, traveling to other Commonwealth nations to document how they were remembering their Queen. But tonight, surrounded by the Highland Hills where Elizabeth had found peace, Margaret understood that she was witnessing not just mourning for a departed monarch, but celebration of a life that had touched the world in ways no one had fully comprehended until it was over. Margaret Thompson's aircraft touched down at Toronto's Pearson International Airport on a crisp September morning. Canada, the Queen's largest realm by territory, was marking the anniversary with events across its vast expanse, from the maritime provinces in the east to British Columbia in the west. The relationship between Canada and Queen Elizabeth II had been unique. She was not just their monarch, but had been a frequent visitor who had traveled to every province and territory, often multiple times. Margaret's editor had arranged for her to cover memorial events in 3 Canadian cities: Toronto, Montreal, and Ottawa. Each city represented a different aspect of Canada's relationship with the Queen. At Toronto as the multicultural heart, Montreal as the French-speaking province where royal sentiment was complex, and Ottawa as the national capital where official ceremonies would take place. Her first stop was the Ontario Legislative Building in Toronto, where Premier Sandra Williams was hosting a memorial reception for community leaders who had met the Queen during her various visits to the province. Margaret was struck by the diversity of the gathering. It reflected the multicultural Canada that had evolved during the Queen's reign, with representatives from dozens of ethnic communities. Premier Williams introduced Margaret to Dr. Raj Patel, a cardiologist who had immigrated from India in 1975. Dr. Patel had an extraordinary story about meeting the Queen during her 1984 visit to Toronto's Hospital for Sick Children. "I was a young resident then," Dr. Patel explained. "The Queen was visiting our pediatric cardiac unit, and I was selected to present our new treatment procedures. I was terrified. I had only been in Canada for 9 years, and my English still carried a heavy accent. But the Queen put me completely at ease. She asked detailed questions about our work, and when I mentioned I had left my family in India to train in Canada, she asked about them with genuine concern." Dr. Patel's voice became emotional as he continued. 3 months later, I received a letter from her private secretary. The Queen had learned that I had passed my certification exams and wanted to congratulate me. She also mentioned that she hoped I would soon be reunited with my family. That personal touch meant everything to a young immigrant trying to build a new life. Margaret was introduced to Maria Gonzalez, who had come to Canada from El Salvador as a refugee in the 1980s. Maria had an unexpected connection to the Queen through her work with refugee resettlement organizations. In 1989, the Queen visited our community center in Toronto, Maria recalled. She specifically asked to meet with recent refugees and immigrants. When she learned about my experience fleeing civil war in El Salvador, she listened with such compassion. She asked about my children's adaptation to Canadian schools, about my hopes for the future. She made me feel that my story mattered, that I belonged in Canada. Maria went on to establish a successful chain of restaurants featuring Central American cuisine and had become a prominent advocate for refugee rights. The Queen's recognition of my worth as a new Canadian gave me confidence to dream bigger. I named my first restaurant Elizabeth in her honor. The reception featured a special presentation by the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, who shared statistics that illustrated the Queen's extraordinary connection to the province. Over her 70-year reign, she had made 27 official visits to Ontario, met with thousands of residents, and supported hundreds of charitable organizations. But, beyond the numbers, the Lieutenant Governor emphasized the personal impact. She had a remarkable ability to make every person she met feel special, the Lieutenant Governor explained to Margaret. Whether it was a school child presenting her with flowers, a war veteran sharing memories, or a community leader discussing local challenges, she gave each person her complete attention and genuine interest. Margaret interviewed several other attendees, each with their own story of royal encounter. Thomas Chen, whose family had immigrated from Hong Kong, told her about the Queen's 1997 visit to Toronto's Chinatown, just months before Hong Kong's return to Chinese sovereignty. The timing was very emotional for our community, Thomas explained. Many Hong Kong immigrants were worried about their families back home, uncertain about the future. The Queen's visit to Chinatown was seen as a gesture of solidarity. She spoke about the contributions of Hong Kong Canadians, and she acknowledged the anxiety many felt about the transition. Her presence gave our community comfort during a difficult time. From Toronto, Margaret traveled to Montreal, where the dynamics around the monarchy were more complex. Quebec's relationship with the British Crown had been complicated by language, culture, and politics, but, even here, the Queen's personal character had transcended political divisions. At the University of Montreal, Margaret attended a symposium examining the Queen's relationship with French Canada. Professor Louise Dubois, a historian specializing in Quebec political culture, provided important context. Quebec separatism was at its peak during much of the Queen's reign, Professor Dubois explained. Many Quebecois saw the monarchy as a symbol of British domination. But Elizabeth II herself was different. She made real efforts to understand and respect French-Canadian culture. She spoke French fluently, she celebrated Quebec's unique traditions, and she treated French Canadians with dignity even when political tensions were high. The symposium featured presentations from Quebecois who had interacted with the Queen over the years. Claude Bergeron, a former mayor of a small Quebec town, shared his memory of the Queen's 1987 visit to commemorate the 400th anniversary of Jacques Cartier's landing. "I was initially skeptical about hosting a royal visit," Claude admitted. "But the Queen surprised me. She gave part of her speech in perfect French, she visited a local maple syrup farm, and she participated in traditional Quebec folk dancing. She showed genuine respect for our culture. Even separatist members of my town council admitted they were impressed." Gabrielle Tremblay, a francophone elementary school teacher, had a different but equally powerful story. In 1978, she had been selected to present the Queen with flowers during a visit to a Quebec City school. "I was 8 years old and spoke no English," Gabrielle recalled. "When I gave the Queen the bouquet, I said Bonjour, Votre Majesté, the only formal words I knew. She immediately responded in French, asking about my favorite subjects in school and complimenting my beautiful dress. She made a little French-speaking girl feel important and valued." Gabrielle went on to become a French language advocate and educator. "That early experience taught me that respect for language and culture could bridge any political divide." The Queen embodied that principle throughout her reign. Margaret also spoke with Dr. Jean-Pierre Rousseau, a Montreal physician who had been involved in organizing medical conferences that the Queen had attended. He offered a unique perspective on her intellectual curiosity. "The Queen attended several medical symposiums in Montreal over the years," Dr. Rousseau explained. "What impressed me was her genuine interest in medical advancement. She asked sophisticated questions about new treatments, about healthcare delivery in remote areas, about medical research funding. She wasn't just going through ceremonial motions, she was genuinely engaged with the substance of our work." From Montreal, Margaret traveled to Ottawa, the national capital, where the most formal memorial ceremonies were taking place. Parliament Hill was the centre of activity, with representatives from across Canada's Indigenous communities, provincial governments, and federal institutions participating in remembrance events. At the National Gallery of Canada, a special exhibition had been mounted featuring portraits of the Queen throughout her 70-year reign, alongside artwork by Canadian artists inspired by themes of service, duty, and national unity. The exhibition curator, Dr. Amanda Foster, provided Margaret with insights into how Canadian artists had depicted the Queen over the decades. "What's fascinating," Dr. Foster explained, "is how Canadian artistic interpretations of the Queen evolved. Early portraits were formal and traditional, but later works showed her as integrated into Canadian landscapes and communities. Canadian artists came to see her not as a foreign monarch, but as an essential part of the Canadian story." One particularly moving section of the exhibition featured artwork by Indigenous Canadian artists. Margaret was introduced to Joseph Crowfeather, a prominent Indigenous artist and activist, who had created a large painting depicting the Queen in traditional Indigenous regalia surrounded by symbols of Canadian wildlife and landscapes. "The relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Crown is complex," Joseph explained to Margaret. "There are legitimate grievances about historical injustices. But Elizabeth II herself worked to acknowledge past wrongs and build better relationships. She participated in Indigenous ceremonies, she supported land rights initiatives, and she spoke publicly about the need for reconciliation." Joseph's painting included symbols representing the various treaty relationships between Indigenous nations and the Crown. "I wanted to show that despite the painful history, there was respect between Indigenous peoples and the Queen personally. She understood that reconciliation required more than words, it required changed relationships." Margaret attended the main parliamentary ceremony on Parliament Hill, where Prime Minister Jennifer Morrison delivered the keynote address. The speech was broadcast live across Canada and touched on themes that resonated beyond politics. "Queen Elizabeth II embodied the best of Canada," the Prime Minister said. "She showed us that diversity is strength, that service to others is the highest calling, and that dignity in the face of change is possible. She helped Canada evolve from a British dominion to a confident, multicultural nation while maintaining the values of tolerance and respect that define us. The ceremony included participation from representatives of Canada's Indigenous communities, recent immigrants, military personnel, and young Canadians. Each group shared how the Queen's example had influenced their understanding of Canadian citizenship. Margaret was particularly moved by the presentation from a group of young new Canadian citizens. These were people from various countries who had completed the citizenship process in the past year, after the Queen's death. Even though they had never lived under her reign, they had studied her example as part of understanding Canadian values. Sarah Kim, who had immigrated from South Korea, spoke on behalf of the group. "We learned about Queen Elizabeth II as part of becoming Canadian citizens. Her example of service taught us that being Canadian means contributing to our communities, respecting diversity, and working for the common good. Even though we never met her, she helped teach us how to be Canadian." That evening, Margaret attended a more intimate gathering at Rideau Hall, the Governor-General's residence. Governor-General Patricia Whitman had invited community leaders, military representatives, and ordinary Canadians who had encountered the Queen over the years for a candlelight vigil and reflection. The gathering took place in the gardens of Rideau Hall, where the Queen had planted trees during various visits. Each tree was now illuminated with soft lights, creating a peaceful atmosphere for remembrance. Margaret found herself in conversation with various attendees, each adding another layer to the story of the Queen's Canadian legacy. Colonel Robert MacDonald, who had served as an aide-de-camp during several royal visits, shared his observations about the Queen's working style during Canadian tours. "She was incredibly professional but also genuinely warm," Colonel MacDonald explained. "She would study briefing materials for hours before each event, memorizing names and details about people she would meet. But then, she would go beyond the script, asking follow-up questions that showed real interest. She turned protocol events into genuine human connections." Margaret spoke with Mrs. Helen Thompson, an elderly woman who had worked as a volunteer coordinator for royal visits for over 30 years. Mrs. Thompson had observed the Queen's interaction with hundreds of Canadian volunteers and had noticed patterns in her approach. "She always thanked volunteers personally," Mrs. Thompson recalled. "Not just a general thank you, but specific recognition of individual contributions. She remembered volunteers from previous visits and asked about their families and activities. She understood that royal events succeeded because of ordinary people's extraordinary efforts." As the candlelight vigil drew to a close, participants were invited to share brief reflections about what the Queen had meant to Canada. Margaret listened as Canadians from diverse backgrounds spoke about leadership, service, unity, and hope. A young Indigenous woman named Jessica Beargrease offered words that particularly resonated with Margaret. "The Queen showed us that true leadership means lifting others up, not putting yourself forward. She used her privilege to highlight other people's accomplishments and struggles. That's the kind of leader we need in every generation." As Margaret prepared to return to Britain the next day, she reflected on what she had learned about the Queen's Canadian legacy. In Canada, she had witnessed how a constitutional monarch could become a unifying figure for a diverse, evolving nation. The Queen had helped Canada navigate its transformation from a British dominion to a multicultural democracy while maintaining social cohesion and shared values. The Canadian memorial events had shown Margaret something important about modern monarchy. In an age when hereditary institutions seemed outdated to many people, Queen Elizabeth II had demonstrated that personal character and dedicated service could give even traditional institutions relevance and meaning. She had not just reigned over Canada's evolution, she had helped guide it with wisdom, dignity, and genuine care for all Canadians. Tomorrow, Margaret would begin the journey home, but she would carry with her the stories of Canadians whose lives had been touched by their Queen's grace, and who were committed to carrying forward her example of service to others. Margaret Thompson's final assignment before returning to London took her to Australia and New Zealand, the two Pacific nations where Queen Elizabeth II had perhaps been most beloved as both monarch and frequent visitor. Her plane touched down in Sydney on a warm September morning, where autumn was just beginning in the southern hemisphere. The timing felt symbolic as Britain moved toward winter and, the end of the commemorative year, the southern realms were entering spring, suggesting renewal and continuation. Australia's relationship with the Queen had been deeply personal. She had visited the country 16 times, more than any other realm outside the United Kingdom. Margaret's first stop was the Sydney Opera House, where a special concert was being held featuring Australian musicians performing pieces that had been meaningful to the Queen during her various visits. Before the concert, Margaret interviewed Dame Patricia Williams, the event's organizer and a distinguished Australian musician who had performed for the Queen on several occasions. Dame Patricia provided context about the Queen's genuine appreciation for Australian culture and talent. The Queen wasn't just politely attending cultural events, Dame Patricia explained. She had a real appreciation for Australian music, art, and literature. During her 1988 visit for the bicentenary, she specifically requested to hear traditional Aboriginal music and contemporary Australian compositions. She understood that Australian culture was unique, not just British culture transplanted. The concert featured a remarkable range of Australian musical traditions. The evening opened with didgeridoo music performed by David Gulpilil, an Aboriginal elder who had performed for the Queen during her 1970 visit. Now in his 80s, he shared with Margaret his memory of that encounter. "I was a young man then, proud to share our ancient music with the Queen," David recalled. "She listened with great respect and asked questions about the spiritual meaning of different songs. She understood that our music is not entertainment but connection to country and ancestors. That respect meant everything to our people." The concert also featured contemporary Australian artists who had been influenced by the Queen's support for the arts. Sarah Chen, a violinist whose parents had immigrated from China, performed a piece she had composed in the Queen's honor. "My parents came to Australia seeking opportunity," Sarah explained to Margaret after her performance. "When I was selected to perform at a Royal Garden Party in 1995, it represented the fulfillment of their immigrant dreams." The Queen's encouragement of young Australian artists, regardless of their background, embodied what we love about this country. Margaret attended a special exhibition at the Australian National Maritime Museum that chronicled the Queen's many voyages to Australia. The exhibition highlighted how her relationship with Australia had evolved from the formal visits of the 1950s to the relaxed, family-friendly tours of later decades. Dr. Michael Robertson, the museum's curator, showed Margaret photographs spanning 6 decades of royal visits. The early images showed the young Queen being formally received by officials in formal dress. Later photographs showed her at barbecues, surf life-saving demonstrations, and community festivals, dressed casually and clearly enjoying herself. What changed, Dr. Robertson explained, was that both Australia and the Queen became more comfortable with each other. By the 1980s, royal visits felt like a favorite aunt coming to stay rather than formal state occasions. One particularly touching section of the exhibition featured letters from Australian families who had hosted the Queen or members of the royal family in their homes. Margaret read about the 1963 visit when the Queen and Prince Philip stayed overnight with the Henderson family on their cattle station in Queensland. Mary Henderson, now 91, had provided a detailed account of that visit. "We were just ordinary farming people," she had written. "But the Queen treated our home with respect and our family with warmth. She helped with the washing up after dinner, played with our children, and sat on the veranda talking about cattle breeding with my husband as if she'd been doing it all her life. She made us feel honored without making us feel inferior." Margaret interviewed several Australians who had encountered the Queen during various visits. Tom Bradley, a former surf lifesaver, told her about the Queen's 1982 visit to Bondi Beach in Sydney. "She was supposed to just watch a surf rescue demonstration," Tom explained. "But she ended up asking detailed questions about our rescue techniques, our training programs, our equipment. She understood that surf life saving was serious business, not just a tourist attraction. When I told her I was studying to become a paramedic, she encouraged me and asked me to write to her about my progress." Tom did write to the Queen, and she responded personally, following his career from surf life saver to paramedic to emergency medical coordinator. Their correspondence continued for 20 years. "She became like a distant but caring mentor," Tom said. "Her interest in my career motivated me to achieve more than I might have otherwise." From Sydney, Margaret travelled to Alice Springs in the heart of Australia's Red Centre. The Queen's 1963 visit to Alice Springs had been historic as the first royal visit to Central Australia. Margaret wanted to understand how Indigenous Australians remembered the Queen, particularly in light of contemporary discussions about Australia's colonial history. At the local cultural center, Margaret met with Eleanor Williams, an errant elder who had been present as a child during the Queen's 1963 visit. Eleanor provided a nuanced perspective on the monarchy's relationship with Indigenous Australians. "The Crown represents complicated history for our people," Eleanor acknowledged. "There's no denying that colonization brought great suffering. But Elizabeth II herself showed respect for our culture and supported our rights." During her later visits, she made efforts to meet with Indigenous leaders and learn about our challenges. Eleanor showed Margaret photographs from the Queen's 1992 visit, when she had specifically requested to visit Indigenous communities and sacred sites. "She didn't just come for photo opportunities. She listened to our elders, she participated in cultural ceremonies, and she spoke publicly about the need for reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians." Margaret learned about the Queen's support for various Indigenous Australian organisations over the years. She had provided patronage for groups working on land rights, cultural preservation, and education. Her Christmas broadcasts often mentioned Australia's Indigenous heritage as an essential part of the nation's identity. From Central Australia, Margaret flew to Melbourne, where she attended a special service at St. Paul's Cathedral. The service brought together representatives from Australia's many migrant communities, reflecting the multicultural nation that had developed during the Queen's reign. Margaret was introduced to Dimitri Papadopoulos, whose Greek immigrant parents had opened a small restaurant in Melbourne in the 1950s. Dimitri had an extraordinary story about the Queen's unexpected visit to their restaurant during her 1977 Silver Jubilee tour. The official program said she would visit the town hall and, then, leave for the airport, Dimitri explained. But, as the royal car was passing our street, she noticed the Greek flags we had hung out in her honor. She asked her driver to stop, and she came into our restaurant unannounced. Dimitri's mother, despite speaking limited English, had served the Queen Greek coffee and homemade pastries. "My mother was terrified but determined to show proper hospitality," Dimitri recalled. "The Queen put her at ease, asking about our village in Greece and our life in Australia. She stayed for 20 minutes, meeting other customers and thanking everyone for their warm welcome." The restaurant had framed the newspaper coverage of that impromptu visit, and it had become a gathering place for the local Greek community. "That visit showed us that we belonged in Australia," Dimitri said. "The Queen's acceptance of our family meant we were truly Australian, not just Greeks living in Australia." Margaret's final Australian stop was Perth, where she attended a youth forum examining the Queen's legacy for younger generations. The forum was organised by the Duke of Edinburgh Award Programme, which the Queen had supported throughout her reign and which had engaged millions of young Australians in community service and personal development. Jessica Morrison, a 23-year-old university student who had completed the gold-level Duke of Edinburgh Award, spoke about how the program had shaped her life. "The award taught me the values the Queen embodied: service to others, perseverance, and personal responsibility," Jessica explained. "Through volunteering at homeless shelters and environmental restoration projects, I learned that privilege means having opportunities to help others." Margaret was struck by how young Australians spoke about the Queen. Even those who questioned the relevance of monarchy in modern Australia respected her personal character and dedication to service. From Australia, Margaret flew to New Zealand, her final destination. If Australia's relationship with the Queen had been warm, New Zealand's had been intimate. The smaller population and more frequent royal visits had created an almost familial connection between the monarch and her New Zealand subjects. In Auckland, Margaret attended a special exhibition at the Auckland War Memorial Museum featuring gifts the Queen had received from New Zealanders over the years, alongside items she had given to various New Zealand institutions. The exhibition revealed the depth of personal connections that had developed over 7 decades. Dr. Jane Smith, the museum's director, explained to Margaret that the collection demonstrated the Queen's genuine affection for New Zealand. "She kept personal mementos from every New Zealand visit," Dr. Smith noted. "Photographs of children she'd met, letters from families, even pressed flowers from New Zealand gardens. These weren't just protocol items, they were treasured memories." Margaret was particularly moved by a display featuring correspondence between the Queen and various New Zealand families. The Queen had maintained personal relationships with several New Zealand families she had met during her visits, sending birthday greetings to children and condolences during family tragedies. One case contained a 20-year correspondence between the Queen and the Mackenzie family of Canterbury. The relationship began when 8-year-old Billy Mackenzie presented her with a drawing of a sheep during her 1977 visit. The Queen had written to thank him, and the correspondence continued through Billy's education, career as a veterinarian, marriage, and parenthood. Billy Mackenzie, now 46, was present at the exhibition opening. He shared with Margaret the impact of this royal friendship on his life. "Having the Queen as a pen pal taught me that everyone's story matters, regardless of their status," Billy explained. "She took interest in my ordinary life, my school achievements, my sports teams, my concerns about the environment. Her consistent kindness motivated me to care about others in the same way." In Wellington, Margaret attended the main national memorial service at the Parliament buildings. Prime Minister Rachel Thompson delivered an address that captured New Zealand's unique relationship with the Queen. "Queen Elizabeth II loved New Zealand with a special affection," the Prime Minister said. "She visited us 12 times, more per capita than any other realm. She understood our landscape, our values, our aspirations. She saw us not as a distant British colony but as a beloved family member with our own character and dreams." The service featured traditional Maori performances alongside European hymns, reflecting New Zealand's bicultural heritage. Margaret spoke with Maori leader James Tao, who provided important context about Indigenous perspectives on the monarchy. "The relationship between Maori and the Crown is complex, rooted in the Treaty of Waitangi," James explained. "But Elizabeth II personally showed respect for Maori culture and supported our rights. She participated in traditional ceremonies, she learned basic Maori phrases, and she spoke about the importance of honoring the treaty relationship." James described the Queen's 1995 visit to Ismari, traditional meeting place, where she had been formally welcomed according to Maori protocol. "She understood that she was a guest on our ancestral land, and she behaved with appropriate respect and humility. That cultural sensitivity created goodwill that transcended political disagreements." Margaret's final interview was with Dame Sarah Williams, a distinguished New Zealand educator who had organized youth programs for royal visits over 30 years. Dame Sarah provided insights into the Queen's special connection with young people. "The Queen had a gift for relating to children and young adults," Dame Sarah explained. "She would remember details from previous visits, asking students about projects they had mentioned, following up on ambitions they had shared. She made each young person feel that their dreams were important and achievable." Dame Sarah shared the story of Maria Patel, a teenager from a low-income family who had met the Queen during a 1990 school visit. The Queen had learned about Maria's interest in medicine despite financial barriers to university education. Through the Queen's private office, Maria was connected with scholarship opportunities and mentorship programs. "Maria is now a leading pediatric surgeon," Dame Sarah noted. She credits the Queen's encouragement as a turning point in believing her dreams were possible. "That's the kind of personal impact the Queen had on individual lives." As Margaret prepared to return to Britain, she attended a final event at Government House in Auckland, a reception for New Zealanders who had received honours from the Queen over the years. The gathering included knights and dames, recipients of various medals for service, and ordinary citizens who had been recognised for exceptional contributions to their communities. Sir Peter Jones, a distinguished scientist, shared with Margaret his thoughts about receiving a knighthood from the Queen in 1998. "It wasn't just the honour itself, but how the Queen presented it," Sir Peter explained. "She had clearly studied my research and asked sophisticated questions about my work on climate change. She understood that science serves society, and she valued that contribution." Margaret spoke with Jenny Chen, a community volunteer who had received the Queen's Service Medal for her work with elderly immigrants. "I never expected recognition for helping my community," Jenny said. "But the Queen understood that small acts of kindness, repeated over time, can transform communities. Her recognition motivated me to continue serving others." As Margaret boarded her flight back to London, she reflected on the month-long journey she had just completed. From the formal ceremonies in London to the intimate gatherings in Scottish villages, from the multicultural celebrations in Canada to the warm family-like connections in Australia and New Zealand, she had witnessed an unprecedented global outpouring of affection and respect for one remarkable woman. The Queen's death had revealed something extraordinary about human nature and about the power of consistent, humble service. Across continents and cultures, People had been inspired by her example to be better citizens, kinder neighbors, and more dedicated servants of their communities. Her death was not just the end of a reign, but the beginning of millions of individual commitments to carry forward her legacy of service. As London came into view through the aircraft window, Margaret realized she had not just been covering a news story, but documenting a historical moment when the world paused to honor not power or wealth or fame, but simple human goodness expressed through a lifetime of duty. Queen Elizabeth II was gone, but the seeds of kindness and service she had planted in millions of lives around the world would continue growing for generations to come. In the years since her death, the world had learned that true greatness lies not in what someone achieves for themselves, but in what they inspire others to become. That was the Queen's greatest legacy, and it would endure long after all the memorial services were concluded and all the tributes were spoken.